Now that I have the man isolated, I'm now going to work on the original layer. So I'm actually not going to deal with adjusting any of the cut content. I'm going to deal with the background layer. So what I will do now is I'll zoom back slightly, and I'm going to apply a color adjustment. And the color adjustment that I'm going to apply is the desaturate option. And before I apply it, something very important to note here. And because I have 3 layers active now in the particular project, each of these layers can be a current layer at any time. Now if you notice the current setup, the man outline layer is the current layer. So if I apply any adjustments or any modifications to the image, it will be done on this particular layer. If I was to leave the layer setup like this, I won't see any changes because this current layer is turned off. Also, it's the wrong layer because I really should have this layer selected. Now that this layer is selected, any modifications, any effects that I apply will be applied to this layer and to this layer only. So what I'll do now is I'll take the color option and I will desaturate. And what it will do is it will turn the image content or the pixel data into grayscale. So now it removes the color from the image. But again, it's only from this particular layer. It's not from the overall image. If I go back and if I turn on the original backup layer, you'll see that's fully intact, hence the reason why I created it. If I turn on the man outline, you'll see that he's still on his own. He's been isolated, and because he was on a different layer, he hasn't been affected by the changes that I've made. And if I was to sit them on top of each other now, you can see that the idea or the effect of stacking layers on top of each other gives the illusion that this particular man here has been isolated in the image and he's the only color element. Actually, it's just a trick in that the layers are stacked on top of each other and the layer behind him is completely grey, whereas just the content on that particular layer has had its color data retained. So now that the back layer has been desaturated, I'm now going to look at applying a gradient map. Now a gradient map takes or analyzes all the color data in a particular layer and it works from dark to light. And what it will do then is it will apply a gradient. Now the gradient will take a particular set of 2 colors and apply them in transition between dark to light. Now at the moment the colors that I have available to me are black and white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the foreground color to, let's say, a light blue of some sort. I then keep the background color as white, and if I go over to my gradients palette over in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see that there are a few different options for gradients from foreground to background, and depending on the color chart that you want to use. So the HSV we're going to avoid, and we're going to use the foreground to background gradient across the RGB standard. Now you can see when I select this particular gradient over here on the toolbox, it shows the linear gradient between blue to white. When I apply a gradient map to this image, it will take the darker colors in the scene and it will apply the foreground color. It will take the lighter colors in the scene and it will apply the background color, and any level in between it will interpolate the color that's to be applied. So what I should see when I apply the gradient map to this image is I should see these areas here turn to blue, turn to a lighter blue, an even lighter blue, and some of the areas that are close to being white will stay white. So to find the gradient map option, I go to Colors, Map, and Gradient Map. Okay, and again, if you notice the tip that it gives, it recolors the image using colors from the active gradient. And the active gradient is this gradient over here. If I had some other gradient available, for example, if I chose this Caribbean Blues, which is some random gradient, what will happen is now the gradient map will be applied in a completely irregular sense. So what I'll do is I'll apply the incorrect gradient first, just to show you what will happen. So when I apply that gradient map, it will start to match in the colors, and I should see some very awful effect up here now on screen. Okay, so there you can see. And the lighter colors, for example here and here, were mapped to the green. The darker colors were mapped to the blue. But obviously this doesn't really represent anything really clever. So I'm going to undo that. Now I'm going to go back to my original default foreground to background gradient. That should give me a nice gradient effect, and I'll apply the same map to the same layer, and I should get a soft transition and basically turn the image into a very light blue, sorry, the layer content into a very light blue. Okay. So now it's been applied and it's colored all of the content, but again you can see dark areas blue, lighter areas white, and everything in between is a linear interpolation across this color chart here. Again, the man on his own still stays as the man on his own. The next thing that I'll do is I'll now apply a gradient or a filter blur. So if I go to the if I go to the filters pull down menu and find the blur option, I'm going to use a Gaussian blur. Again, simplest and most common way of using blur. So I click on it, and the dialog box that appears will give me the options for the amount of pixels that I'm going to use. Okay. So as I apply less pixels, I apply less blur, therefore the definition of the image either stays exactly as it was or becomes very blurred. So if I was to apply, let's say, a 20 pixel radius blur, you can see the detail level has been turned down quite drastically. If I click OK, again, it's only to this particular layer that the blurring effect is being applied. Because of the complexity of the blurring operation, you can see that the transition and the progress is taking its time. On other software, for example Photoshop, does this effect fairly quickly, but again it has more advanced algorithms built into it, so therefore it can do it quicker. The result will still be the same. Okay, so now you can see the outline effect, okay, very blurred. So I have basically taken away the background and isolated it and added focus to the man himself. Okay, so now he sits in a very prime position. So if you were to apply this idea to, let's say, a supermarket scene, so you're designing a product that sits in a new supermarket or sits in a new shop or sits on a street, for example a bus shelter, you could take an existing street scene and you could take away or de-emphasize the existing scene and put in a more put the focus towards your product or your image or the area to which you're going to change or do something dramatic to in your particular scene. So it's a reasonably simple way of isolating content, emphasizing that content or de-emphasizing the external or the other content. And again, when I'm finished, I'd now save this as a GIMP file. So I'm going to save it as an XCF file, and I'm going to call it Street Scene 01 Complete. And that now will be an XCF file in the appropriate folder that I have saved for this particular tutorial. So that now ends this particular tutorial.